Okay, hello. I'm here today online with Lynne McTaggart, which is a great honor, and I'm very excited to be talking to Lynne because I know she has so much pertinent information for us all. Lynne is author of several books, particularly known for What Doctors Don't Tell You and The Field. And I know you have a new book coming out, Lynne, so maybe you'd like to say hello and then tell us about your new work.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, Swan. And it's wonderful to be with you all. I am a great, great fan of the Club of Budapest. And I think we need it more than ever now with the big change of government. We've seen all the big ruptures in America and elsewhere. Um, my new book is called The Power of Eight. It won't be out until September 2017. But it's about the power of intention in small groups and some of the miraculous things that I've witnessed, cataloged, and now scientifically studied about what happens when a group of 8 to 12 get together and do an intention together.
That's very interesting. So, with the power of eight, obviously, is an exponential increase in energy from the power of two or more, as Jesus would have said, when two or more gather in my name. So, does it
Yes.
increase exponentially with the golden mean?
No, it's nothing as simple as that. What it is a virtuous circle, and where a lot of the people who are doing the sending as well as the people receiving it are affected. So it's really quite amazing, and we've been doing some scientific studies on it. We're completing those studies, but they look like pretty amazing about what happens to the brainwaves and immune systems of all of the people involved, both center and.
So, it's particularly a group of eight, not more than eight, like 144,
Well,
for
no, no,
example.
no. I mean, we've done it with 25,000. We've
Right.
done intention experiments with 25,000. It's just there's no. It's just the power of more than a few.
Mm.
Basically, it's the power bigger than the power of one.
Right.
And I think once you start getting a small group together of some sort or a large group, it's not like it goes up mathematically. It just becomes this incredible vortex of energy that heals as well as heals the sender as well as the receiver. But as I say, my book isn't out for an entire year, so I'm really happy to talk about it more then.
Okay, great. Well, let's talk about some of your work to date because I know there's a whole plethora of subjects that you've been involved in, bridging science and spirituality.
Well, I think the one that's most relevant right now is because there's been shockwaves with some of the elections, as I mentioned, going on right now, with Donald Trump now becoming president-elect of the U.S., and of course the liberal establishment, the liberal people out there, which are most of my readers, are in total shock. And also we have Brexit, and we have all kinds of things that are really changing our landscape, and people saying, "My goodness, what's going on here?" It's very interesting. My book, The Bond, really addressed a lot of the issues that we're facing right now. I wrote that book right after the whole financial crisis of 2008. And what occurred to me was I was writing a book about whether we were meant to be competitive. Was Darwin right, basically? And I was really inspired to write that because I saw instances of great competitiveness and also unfairness. And I suspected that unfairness might be an absolute central cancer that is causing a lot of the crises that we have today. I even started a fairness campaign. And it's very interesting to me to see that the whole American election is really about unfairness. And this is something that the liberal community is not really delving into as much as we should. And that should be our mantle, and it's not. It's shocking that it took a Donald Trump to bring this out to this degree. And I'm fascinated, too, to think about the people in the arts industries. I was just thinking about this the other day because I was speaking with some actors that I know, and they were telling us they've been filmed as part of sort of the second tier of actors in very, very successful series on TV in America. And these actors are, and of course the leads are making millions and mega millions, and so are the producers and the directors, etc. And a lot of these actors are asked to work without pay for the rehearsals and the dress rehearsals and the makeup checks and all of this other stuff, and to pay for their own transportation. And I thought to myself, all of Hollywood has been screaming about Trump and saying how wretched and terrible it is. And these are the people who have the same system of the 1% versus the 99% in microcosm form. Now, I know the same thing occurs in the book industry. Exactly the same. The typical contract with an author is the publisher gets 93.5% of every paperback sale, and the author gets 7.5%. So you just start looking at throughout. It's not just Wall Street, but our entire system is predicated on terrible unfairness. And what's really interesting is that system is really collapsing. And what we're seeing with a Trump, et cetera, is probably a necessary shift. Gene Houston once called them jump times, where they don't occur smoothly. They're an erratic, crazy thing, like two tectonic plates colliding and causing an earthquake. And that's really what's going through now. This old system is not working for most of the people most of the time. And so we are watching evolution unfold. This is the beginning of the shift we've all been talking about.
That's right, because it's really been, building for some time. I mean, it was clear with the George Bush election that the electoral system was rigged and not working. And this has been a universal theme pretty much everywhere you go in the world. That elections aren't fair, that corporations are profiting massively from greed whilst people are struggling to pay their bills. So if we're finally seeing the collapse now, then maybe this is a good thing.
Well, it's not going to be pretty, but it's necessary. It's necessary. And this is not going to be pretty. This could be a big rupture of systems. I mean, I'm hoping it's smoother than I think it's going to be, but it was probably necessary. And unfortunately, I did not vote for Donald Trump. I'm an American. But I'm coming to think that this was the necessary step. It had to be. Because if we'd had a Clinton presidency, it was going to be more of the same.
Well, that's the problem, and I'm astonished at how many Americans seem to be upset about Trump, but not fully realizing that the potential alternative wasn't looking great either, that the history there is not impressive.
Well, the point is, too, it is just more of the same. It is that whole Wall Street business 1% situation that is not working for most people. And as I say, it's now got to a point where people finally have revolting, are basically saying, we can't live like this anymore. No. So what I find is interesting about this is, just the evolution of what's necessary. Because when I wrote the bond, I was looking at 4 different ways that people need to change, because this is the beginning of a much, much bigger shift. What we're really looking at is the need to change the way we're relating to each other in the West, the change the way we're doing everything. What was interesting for me in the bond when I did the research, and I was not just looking at the science, like physics, I was looking at psychology and anthropology and biology and, more or less all the ologies. And to ask that question, were we meant to be competitive? Is Darwin right? And the resonant answer, the just resounding response was no, he wasn't right. We were meant to be much more cooperative, and when we are, we thrive. When we're not, it collapses ultimately. And so you're seeing the end game of a level of unfairness and an unsustainable kind of competition that was meant to fail eventually anyway. But many of the things that we need to do are very different. They require a real revolution in the way we relate, the way we see. Everything has to be much more inclusive. So we're in that very beginning. Those of us in my kind of business have been talking about the shift for many years. Yeah. And here we are. Here it's happening, and it's, as I say, it's going to be a bumpy ride. Fasten your seatbelt.
I must say, I thought that we would have hit this point about 10 years ago or more, and I'm surprised it's taken so long. And I do wonder how bad it's going to have to get and what it is going to take before we create the shift that we want to see in the world.
Well, that depends, I think, about how involved we all are. There's a lot of change that can happen very easily. I had a friend called Al Lowenstein, who was a friend of mine. He was a junior congressman when I knew him back in the 1970s. I was a very young person then. And Lowenstein had decided, and this was before my coming of age, that Lyndon Johnson had unfairly escalated the war. Now, at the time, he had no money, he had no influence. He wasn't even a congressman then, but he decided that somebody needed to do something, and he was that somebody. So he started lecturing around campuses, and he started a Dump Johnson movement. And it gathered, ultimately, with just him, it gathered so much force that Johnson decided voluntarily not to seek a second term. He became so unpopular, largely based on this one person.
That must have been the last time in Western history that a politician listened to the people.
He had to. But a lot of them had, in the sense that if you look at Richard Nixon got very paranoid in the late 60s and early 70s because of the campus movements that were happening across the campus in response to the Vietnam War and Watergate and Kent State, where four students were shot, unarmed students were shot by the National Guard. All of these things mobilized students across the country. You haven't seen that kind of an organized effort since, basically. And so a lot of it really depends on us. I mean, turn it around the other way. Look at Donald Trump. Donald Trump had the entire media against him. I'm not a Trump supporter, believe me, but it's a fascinating phenomenon. He had everybody against him. Everybody. He had to really scrounge. He had the whole Republican Party pretty much distancing themselves. He had nobody really of any import at his convention. He had only one newspaper in the entire country, I think, supported him. Everybody else went for Clinton. All he had was social media, and he wins. And yet he used half the money. Of course, he's a billionaire. He has a lot of money to go flying around in his own jet, etc., and go to rallies. But the point was, he spent half of what the Democrats spent, but he just had a resonant message. Well, there's all of us now who are wanting to see a change in the way we are doing everything in our world. And so we've got to light the candle to show the way, and that means everybody, not just, people who are in this work like you and like me, but everybody listening out there really needs to be involved now. And a movement has to happen. Movements are powerful. They're hugely powerful, and they can start really small, but it is about organization, really. And I think up to now there have been lots of little movements that need to just come together, and it needs to be a groundswell, bottom-up type of situation of people saying, this is what we want as an alternative. And I think actually the politicians are listening. I think they're scared to death after Brexit. The British politicians just turned around again against all of the advice of the experts and the people in charge. The people said no, So this is probably a unique point in modern history where politicians are more likely to listen.
Well, let's hope so. So how do we move forward? Do we drop the system and start creating our own systems, or do you suggest that we be working to change the systems?
Well, I think we do drop some of the systems. I mean, as I say, it starts with some of the people who are interested, who give a lot of lip service to our kind of work. So they have to start looking, well, how are they operating? As I say, look at Hollywood. How is that operating? That's operating like Wall Street, actually.
Yeah.
That needs to change.
Yeah.
The book business, they're all horrified, they're all liberals, et cetera, et cetera. They operate like Wall Street. They have to change too. And we who are looking to change, we have to start being more inclusive. How is it that the liberals, the people who are the champions of the people out there, completely ignored all of the people? 1/3 of Americans without a college education are out of work now. And most of the people without a college education haven't had a pay rise since 1970. They're at the same level of pay. So people have to start listening to them. And we have a hard time. See, one of the things that we really have to learn how to relate to people who are not like us. That is the challenge. And I always find it really fascinating if you do talk to people who are very different from you with a different set of values, or a different set of priorities and other things that make them seem so different. Actually, when you delve deeper, they have the same values. We all want to keep our kids safe and, have good schools and have good roads and, have a good roof over our head and enough food and enough money to pay our bills. And that's kind of it.
Well, yes, and one of the challenges with the kind of work we do and the consciousness that we're into and talking about is reaching people who aren't into it and don't have that awareness and might call it conspiracy theories or New Age woo-woo stuff.
Yes.
And that can be very challenging when we know what the doctors don't tell us. We know what the corporations and the pharmaceutical industry are up to.
Yes.
And I had the conversation today about Wi-Fi with someone who said, oh, no, there's no proof that it has a bad effect on you. And, of course, we know there is.
Well, I think it's, there's a really good story about this. Probably the most diametrically opposed people in the States are people who are pro or anti-abortion. That's one of the biggest hot buttons in the States. And a few years ago, there was a shooting in Planned Parenthood, which is got abortion clinics. It's pro-choice for women. And this was by a pro-life person. And the people on both sides, the pro-life people and the pro-choice people, said, this is getting really serious. And they killed a number of people in Planned Parenthood. We have to get together. So they met in secret for a few years. And during that time, they learned, and I mean, believe me, this is the emotional hot button of #1 in the States. They learned how to tone down their inflammatory language and just talk about why they believe what they believe, and talk vulnerable, in a state of vulnerability from the heart. Why do I believe? How did I get to this belief system? And the others were learn to listen and not respond, and just listen to why. And during that time, they started coming together and figuring out things they could do to work together. And when there was another threat on Planned Parenthood, it was the pro-life people who tipped off the pro-choice people. And by the end, they met after these few years. They decided to hold a press conference, and the press got together with them. The press, of course, asked the question that they would, which is, so who won the debate? And they said, well, no one, because now that we believe we've told and talked about why we believe what we believe. We believe what we believe even more firmly. And so the reporters said, well, then it's been a failure, right? And they said, oh no, because now we go out together, we party together, we watch each other's children, we love each other. The point is you find a bridge, but it happens usually with that state of vulnerability of speaking deeply from the heart. So some of the ways, and not just seeking the people who are like us, because we when we look for friendship groups, etc., we always look for people just like us, because we feel that's the only way we can make friends. Is, we have to reaffirm we're right all the time by finding people who are clones of us, And so part of the thing of changing with this new world is really starting to learn how to make those connections. And there are many instances beside this. A guy called Orland Bishop, I write about in my book, who is teaching rival gang members in Watts in Los Angeles to speak to each other in loving kindness. Imagine what an idiotic fool's errand it seems like. But he's succeeding because he's once again asking them to speak vulnerably from the heart and, speak to each other in truth. And the heart, like that kind of truth, allows the heart to leap across the fence.
So really, this is the communication, and nonviolent communication is the key.
Nonviolent communication, and also a kind of dialogue where you're not trying to convince someone to come to your side. Most of our discussions that we have with other people is trying to convince people we're right and you're wrong. So we don't have a discussion or a dialogue, we have a debate. And we want to show them they're wrong, particularly if they're really on the other side. And so this is learning a new way of holistic communication that's really incredibly important. That is about so much more about not reaching a conclusion, but just sharing.
That's right. But in some cases that can be pretty tricky, especially when there's division within families. An issue, for example, that comes to mind is the vaccination issue, which I actually had major conflict with my first husband, father of my first son, who was absolutely furious and took me to court because I wouldn't vaccinate my children.
Mm-hmm. That's, it is very tricky. It is very tricky. And all you can do is to try to, listen in love, speak in love, all of those things, and try to keep the conversation, keep the tone low and open. And set the agenda for that, but listen to him too. Where is that coming from? That absolute, and certainly you're both wanting to do the best for the child, and it's just your definition of best is different from his definition of best. And so it is tricky. It takes a lot of listening, and this goes all across the board. But it's the only way. Otherwise, we're going to turn into something very tribal. Yes. Of us. It's going to be even more us versus them. But that is where I see a real key to evolution is a new kind of communication, a new kind of seeing. Because once again, we don't see very inclusively. We see who are the people just like us. And Westerners are really blind to difference. They find this all the time with Westerners having problems with, latent inhibition, latent blindness. I mean, it's so bad that they concern themselves with seasoned pilots, when they're working on simulators. This will never happen to a novice pilot, but oftentimes they'll have superimposed on the screen all of the information about landing and all of the stuff. And the pilot's so busy looking at that, the seasoned pilot, that he misses that he's just about to land on top of another thing in this, another plane in this simulation. Novice pilot will never do that because he's always awake with all of his senses. But, we get to a point of drifting off to sleep, and we see very selectively in the West. Eastern people see very differently. Imagine two students sitting in front of the Mona Lisa. When we see the Mona Lisa, our eyes will tend to focus in on the face, what we think is the individual, the central point of the painting, whereas an Easterner will see all kinds of things. We'll see the background, and the body sort of becomes just part of this interpenetrating background. They've even done tests on Easterners, and they find that their eyes are moving much faster than we are because they're taught about relationships. We're taught from the time we're children to read things like Fun with Dick and Jane. That was the book I learned with, which are the comings and goings of individuals. See Dick run. Whereas Easterners are taught about relationship. They're taught with little books that go something like this. Big brother is sitting with little brother. Little brother loves big brother. Big brother looks after little brother. They're taught about interpenetrating relationships. And that governs how you see. So some of the things we have to do, too, are really changing how we see and how inclusive we are. But probably the biggest thing of all is to understand the need to be fair and to take turns. That's probably the key element that I felt was important, and the thing that is now lacking. The need, humans, they found this in so many studies with game theory, game theory is how economists measure things. They put people in a tight spot and then see how they behave to sort of model what human behavior is. And so they played a game called the ultimatum game. And in this game, let's say we're working with pounds. They have two people who have never met each other, and they're never going to meet each other again. And they give one of them, let's say it's me, 10 pounds. And they say, okay, you can split this with Swan in any way you want. And of course, the assumption is that, and of course, if you say you're going to accept it, you accept the split as is. If you say no, thank you, that means neither of us get any money. So of course, everybody assumes that what's going to happen is that I'll give you a pound and I'll keep 9 pounds for myself. And you'll say, okay, I'll take it because something is better than nothing. Well, this game has been played around the world, even with people who don't have money. We're just playing for tobacco. And guess what the most common split is? 50-50. No matter where we go, it's played, the most common split is 50-50. So people are inherently fair. But they expect other people to be fair back, and they get pretty pissed off when people aren't. Yeah. So there's another game called the public goods game. And in this game, you get a group of people, and everybody's given 10 pounds. And they can put a certain amount into the pot. And then that gets redistributed. So the secret of the game is the more you put in, everybody puts in, the more everybody gets out. And initially, a lot of people are generous, and they put a decent amount in, and then they play for subsequent rounds. And in subsequent rounds, there's always somebody, or one or two people who are stingy, don't put much in. And this pisses the other people off. So they put in less in the next one, and less in the next one, until nobody's putting in anything. And that's kind of where we are right now. We're in a public goods game nobody wants to play. And so the challenge is starting to look at a totally different way of being that is much more inclusive and fair. Because fairness, in my mind, is the key to the whole thing.
Yes, yes, absolutely. It's getting people to be willing to sit at the table and listen. And talk, and dialogue, and
sure.
Also, nonviolent communication works really well when both parties or all parties involved know the rules and know how to actively listen, how to communicate in a healthy way. But that can be extremely difficult when you're trying to use that methodology with people who have no idea about nonviolent communication.
No, but they can learn, and if you're listening to them first and hearing them in a non-judgmental and non-superior way, because in most cases we're talking about people who may not have as much education or whatever, who need to talk. They need to talk about their lives, and we need to listen. And because we have a different level of wanting to change and fairness, etc., but it's more critical in the cases of a lot of the people who were voting for Brexit, voting for Donald Trump. They're voting with their lives. their lives are really, really not working. So I think we have to look at this. But there's a lot of other things, too, which we can do. There is the power of protest. That's a very powerful thing indeed. And the power of coming together. I mean, one of the issues I think that our new age community, our new consciousness community lacks is connections, enough connections where we're unified. That's why organizations like the Club of Budapest are so important, because they're really bringing together large groups of people to start talking about these things and coming up with plans.
Yes, that's right. And one of the things that's happened with the internet, of course, is people spend a lot of time on the internet, and it's creating a lot more separation in some ways.
Yes.
Because we lose the intimacy of direct connection, of being in presence where we can be in a more heart-to-heart field with each other.
Yes. And another thing that we can possibly do is learn how to use the internet. If this is our technology now, learn how to use it to make better connections. I mean, I work with people over an entire year where we put people into small groups of 8 to 12. That's their group. These people have never met physically, but they are best friends. They're now family, essentially, to each other, because they're looking after, they've got each other's back, basically. They're intending for each other. They're working a lot together.
Yeah, that's right. It's the ways that we can come together, and of course, sacred activism too. So what are the causes that we are most passionate about, or where we can put our energy and attention and know we can make a difference?
Yes, and it's about also just being smart and organizing together. For instance, I mean, one of the things that I'm interested in with What Doctors Don't Tell You is ensuring that natural medicine is freely available. Now, one of the benefits of the UK coming out of Europe is that there are about 12 very restrictive laws that were set up by Brussels that would limit availability of high-dose supplements and certain forms of natural medicine, particularly herbal medicine. And by coming out of the EU, the UK now has the ability, for the first time, to reject those laws, which would have been very harmful to British businesses, but also mainly harmful for consumers' inability to get hold of a lot of these products and inability to make any kind of claims about them. So there's an example of an important issue. But when this was first raised in 2003 or 4, we very naively, my organization very naively thought, well, you know what, we can stop this law. We just need to get the homeopaths and the acupuncturists and all those kinds of people together, and they will all come together in a group, and we'll all discuss it, and everybody will agree, and we'll be a super group. We got about 50 different heads of organizations together, and they spent a whole afternoon fighting. Nothing got agreed, and we had a very small group by the end who were just carrying forward. And really, the person who has done that has been Rob Kirk from the Alliance of Natural Health, has really kept the flame going and kept working on this all this time, and been a real thorn in the side of Brussels to try to keep pushing and fighting in the courts for justice. But that suggested to me that when we start looking at really important issues of change, people have to start looking real big picture here and start looking at, because most of the groups said, this isn't going to affect me. I mean, we're homeopaths or we're acupuncturists, so this isn't going to affect me. And of course, it did eventually, because first they came for the supplements, then they came for herbal medicine, now they're after homeopathy, etc., etc. So it's really important for people, the people who are interested in transformation, to start pulling together and looking at the bigger picture and connecting together. I think that's probably one of the bigger issues for all. It's, a lot of people do believe in a ground-up swell of things. But I think also there has to be a certain amount of direction and connection between people doing this together. We've seen that in the past, and I think we'll see that again in the future.
It seems to me as we're talking that it really boils down to a few very simple precepts, and one of them is, free choice, acceptance of other people's choices and freedom to make our own choices.
Yes, and right now we don't have that freedom, but also fairness. There is
fairness.
There is fairness. The systems, there have to be major changes in the way we reward companies and wealth. There need to be major changes in the way that that governments are run. I mean, American government is incredibly corrupt now.
Yeah.
It's now the lobbying system. There are it's hard to believe. I think about when I started out as a journalist and the Food and Drug Administration, they were the good guys. There was a whole investigative team who were investigating doctors who were creating phony drug testing. They were falsifying their data. And this team was so impressive. I couldn't believe them. They were the good guys rooting out evil. Now the Food and Drug Administration is populated by people from the pharmaceutical industry, and it's paid for by the pharmaceutical industry. It's just another lobbying situation.
And
so
we have that, and we have the banksters.
Yes.
Taxation and the banksters, and basically those are our governments.
Yes, they are. So, but the thing that's so interesting here is the power of vote, the power of the people, because once again, what happened with this American election were the banksters wanted Hillary Clinton, with all that money.
She was Rothschild's choice.
Yeah, it didn't happen. So where we take heart from that, whether or not we wanted Trump, is to say, the people still have power. They have huge power. And it has to be about a movement for change, an education process for change, and also an understanding of possibility, where we can go and why it's so important to change. And from my perspective, how come we're operating according to an old story, an outdated story that doesn't really serve anymore? I mean, all of the new science, and I mainly look at physics and things, suggest that we're operating with a real old set of rules.
Yeah, well, we are at a cellular level and a soul level too. Unless, it takes a huge amount of work to change those paradigms in all levels of our consciousness so that we can have an effect on our new reality.
Yes, but it just understanding, so many things write the story we live by, whether it's philosophy or religion or whatever. But science, to modern man and woman, actually writes the biggest chunk of the story, because science tells us who we are as humans, and from there we determine how we're supposed to live. And the scientific story we've had till now has described us as, lonely individuals, essentially, that live, as entirely encapsulated, separate entities. And we end with the hair on our skin, at which point the rest of the universe begins. But the new science shows us that's completely wrong, that actually we are part of a totally interconnected universe on every level. It's not just our subatomic parts of our body, but we now know that my brain and what's coming into my consciousness is completely imitating. The same neurons are firing as yours are. When you're doing a movement, my neurons totally imitate that too. We are so interconnected brain-wise. We're interconnected by the way we operate. We're constant copycats in every way. And there are so many things. And we also know from our biology that, from epigenetics now, that we're not built from inside out. We're built from outside in. We're built because of our relationship, our bond with our environment. And our environment in every, the food we eat, the water we drink, the friends we have, sum total of how we live our lives. All of this affects which genes get expressed. So genes sit there like a piano, very silently, until something plays them, and that's the outside. So we know that also our environment, our bond, our connection with the outside world is also creating us at every moment. So all of this new science suggests a very different paradigm, very different story from what we've been told.
Well, it's very interesting because I do a lot of remote healing with people. And I have some people, who insist, no, we want to see you in person. And I now do not see people in person because because I don't. It's so much more powerful when you get what can happen when we're not in person. If we're not even looking at each other on Skype, if I just tell you at 5 o'clock in the evening, I'm going to work on you, that is when they feel the biggest shift.
Wow, that's so interesting. That really accords with a lot of the research I've seen on precognition, on forecasting information, on even intention, the effect of intention. It's affected better when it's remote and it's out of time.
That's it. It's extraordinary, isn't it? And it's been a hard one for me to let go of because I think, maybe I ought to be present because the client's paying me and they feel more connected. And I've just let go of it all completely. Because I know that's what works best. And when they're willing to step up to that and they get that, everything starts to shift.
Interesting.
And as you're talking about this symbiotic relationship we have with each other, I had an interesting meditation in which my guide showed me that we on Earth are affecting the electromagnetic field and the sunspots of the sun as much as the sun is affecting us. That's it's a totally symbiotic relationship.
Well, this is it. I mean, we know there's plenty of evidence showing that electromagnetic energy and the energy, it's really the magnetic energy and geomagnetic energy from the sun has a profound effect on all living things on Earth, and particularly the two engines of the human body, the heart and the brain. They have a huge effect on us. But there's also a lot of planetary geomagnetic stuff going on in between planets. And then, of course, we are energetic beings, too. So this is a big symbiotic situation going on all the time. We are, just energetic entities. We are energy.
That's right.
And constantly changing, mutating energy.
But you're not saying you're into those conspiracy theories with other life out there, are you?
Not interested. I mean, we did run a UFO conference once, my organization, but we had government officials from the UK government, from the US, and astronauts. We had, legitimate people coming to talk about it. They all did say there is something out there, and they had some evidence for it, but it's not something I've really researched.
No, of course not. But it's sort of, there's a big universe out there, so...
Definitely. I mean, most astronauts say we're not alone.
Yeah, that's right. Well, that seems like a beautiful point to come full circle, and it brings us back to the unified field, doesn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, what's really important to understand is, we're operating because, as I said earlier, science tells us how to live because it defines who we are, and from there we determine, okay, what are we going to do? How are we going to live our lives? And we set up all of our societal structures based on who we think we are. But we've set up societal structures based on the idea that life is a race to the finish line. That is the essential idea that underpins, Darwinian thought really has permeated our everyday. The idea that, that there just isn't enough out there, and so we all better race to get our piece of it first before the other guy comes. And that's, that has set up our financial model, our societal model in all of the West and in most of the world now. And that is plainly, absolutely, evidently wrong. So if that's the case, then we have to come up with a new way to be. It's that simple. And a lot of people think that evolution is a little bit like fairy dust. They felt that once 2012 happened, we were just going to have the shift and we could just sit here and sit back and, not even think about it and get a little fairy dust of 2012 and boom, life would be really changed and we'd be totally evolved.
I thought Ashtar Command was going to beam us up to another planet so we could go and mess that one up too.
Maybe he should have. But it isn't going to be like that. It's going to be a bumpy ride. It's going to be a jump time. And also, we're going to have to take a stake in it. We're going to have to, right now, the world is on a path of atomization, which is, creating more and more and more separateness, more and more individuation. And that's what's so dangerous now. And what we have to do is start reversing that in all kinds of ways, small and large. But we have to first recognize that that story is an old-fashioned, out-of-date, false trail, that story of who we are. And so when we start recognizing that we are happier and better when we're connected in every way, then that starts setting the agenda for change.
Well, we all feel happier when we have a good day, or we do a random act of kindness, or we say something nice to someone and we see their face light up, We know someone's having a bad day and we empathize and reach out to them. And it changes the whole dynamic for them and for ourselves.
Absolutely. And I mean, one of the things that I've found in trying to figure out why the power of 8 works so much is the incredible power of altruism and how it is a healing aspect of our lives. And it's really, really important. But what I'm really talking about, too, is true evolution, where we're going to be changing the structures by which we live. And that is going to happen. And there is going to be an element of things where we just sit back and we watch. I think there's going to be a breakdown of a lot going on. And there may be all kinds of messy ruckus right now going on in the States. I mean, the last thing I saw today is there's a big petition going around to end the Electoral College vote.
Yeah,
because Hillary Clinton won about 1 million votes more than Donald Trump, yet he has won because of the Electoral College system. So some people are trying to get the states to quickly ratify that. Now, that's an interesting prospect, because if it does, there's going to be a revolution from the people who voted for him. And then suddenly the game is shifted and the game rules change. So we have to expect, if that happens, then there's going to be a fury with half of the population. If it doesn't happen, there is a fury with the other half of the population. So there's there is a powder keg about to blow there in lots of ways.
Yeah, and there's still the question of what actually happened with the people's hero, Bernie Sanders. And
Yes.
And the people who wanted him, he had a massive movement behind him.
Yes, he did. And here's the most interesting thing of all. If you peel away all of the misogyny and the racist comments, etc., and the messy stuff and the extremism of Trump, and you look at what he was talking about, it's not completely unlike what Bernie Sanders was talking about. Most of the people on both sides want the exact same thing. They want to end the 1% issue. They want to stop corruption on Wall Street. They want to stop corruption in Washington. They want a fairer situation for people where they're, a fairer situation. They want infrastructure. They want more jobs in those areas, etc. All said the exact same thing. And so it's, with the exception of abortion and guns, more or less, they said exactly the same thing. So here's the interesting thing. You've got the left, the progressives, and you've got the so-called reactionaries are really saying the exact same thing. And the people who are keeping them separate are the politicians and calling it different. So one of our challenges as evolutionaries is trying to find that common situation and find that common ground. But there needs to be a big change. It needs to be a big change, and we have to find systems to start creating that.
I had an amazing mother-in-law who was an ambulance driver during the Second World War in London, and she was always nostalgic for the time of the war and the 40s and the Glenn Miller. And when I talked to her about it, she said we were so unified. The women
Yes.
driving the ambulances were
Yes.
so connected.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's the thing. That sense, and that brings me to another really important point, which is one way that this could happen. There's a really interesting study, one of the most beloved psychological studies of all time, done by a guy called Mustafa Sherif, who basically created social psychology. It was done, I believe, in the 1950s, and he took two groups of 12-year-old boys, and he sent them into summer camp in separate buses, and they were kept separate. They had separate living quarters. They were asked to have separate identities and names, so they had flags and different names. One were the Rattlers, one were the Eagles, and they were never met. And finally, when they did meet, they met on the playing field, and they were engaged in highly, highly competitive games. And watching from the sidelines were a bunch of camp counselors who were actually social psychologists in disguise. And they didn't have to stoke much competition. The kids were killing each other. They were ripping each other's flags up. They were beating each other up. They hated each other. They wouldn't even eat together. And no amount of getting them together to get to know you would do any good. It didn't help at all. They hated each other. They really, really created animosity. So then the psychologists engineered a series of crises in the camp. They put a truck in a ditch, and the boys had to work together to pull it out. And they put an impediment in the water supply, and the boys had to work together to get it out. And, guess what happened? They began sitting together. They began befriending each other and eating together. And by the end of the camp, they unanimously voted to ride home on the same bus together. And one of the heads of one of the groups spent all of his prize money on buying ice creams and treats for the whole lot. Now, what that's called is a superordinate goal. And what that means is a goal that's larger than, that can only be achieved by the collective efforts of everyone involved. And that's exactly what's needed right now, like the war. Now, one of the worrying things is the thing that brings people together is war.
Yeah.
So we need to create something, not a war, that is a war of change, not a war of fighting, to unite the people left and right. Because, as I said, strip away what the politicians are doing, strip away all the rhetoric and the guns and and all of the other stuff, and what you're really talking about is more or less the same thing. People wanting more or less the same thing. And if you can find that bigger kind of goal, that is the way you bring people together.
That's right. So really, it boils down to these few things, coming together, the power of 8.
Yes.
Transformation, healing, consciousness, and communication.
Yes, and the coming together, and the intention. I mean, I've been doing a lot of work with the power of intention. I've run 29 intention experiments using the power of consciousness to change physical matter. And we've done experiments on everything from making seeds grow faster to purifying water to even trying to lower violence in war-torn areas. And of the 29 experiments, and I've worked with very credible, prestigious scientists working at universities, 25 of them have shown measurable, mostly significant results. So, I mean, that you can't usually get those kinds of results with any one of the, a number of very, very successful drugs. Mm-hmm. So the power of consciousness and collective consciousness as group consciousness is really extraordinary. And as I say, it's something I'm really studying about this now and will be producing my next book on. And those little groups and the intention used in those small groups is an amazing agent of change for both you, the sender, and you, the receiver. So it has a lot of things. I talked about altruism before, but also the power of community. I mean, we found people aren't made to be isolated. We need to belong. And that is a healer. And one of the problems we have these days is we are so isolated. So whether it is is a group, virtual group on the internet, but you need a tribe. You need a tribe for every possible reason.
That's a wonderful way to end the call. Thank you. We are starting, some friends and I, some colleagues and I, a regular video and audio streaming channel, and we're calling it Let's Get Synced. So
wonderful.
SYNC', not SINKED. But
wonderful.
It's very apposite because this is what we're talking about here. However
Yes.
we carry out our sacred activism, but we have to really urgently get together now and
absolutely
get this new show on the road.
Absolutely. Great. Yes.
Well, Lynn, I know we're all looking forward to your new book, 2017. Bring it on as soon as you can. And
thank you. Thank you. And we have, the other thing I do is I run workshops, both as retreats. I have one in Tuscany that's coming up next May. And I also have where it's a week-long thing where we not only sample Italian wine and travel to places like Florence, but we also do intention boot camp, basically.
Okay.
And I'm also run an intention master class. And it's a year-long thing where I put people in groups, and we, after training them again with intention boot camp, we watch the miracles unfold. So I welcome for people to come to my website, lynnmctaggart.com, and also to check out What Doctors Don't Tell You at wddty.com. That stands for What Doctors Don't Tell You. We've had a lot of opposition with that magazine, even pharmaceutically backed organizations trying to take us down. And we found the power of community. They've tried to ban us. The power of community and the power of social media. We were able to fight off all kinds of powerful forces trying to shut us down successfully, and use it as a platform just through social media and basically garnishing our supporters. So I know the power of small groups to make big changes. It's happened to us, and I really urge people to get involved.
Thank you. That the conversation has given me more hope than any of the conversations I've had to date.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and thank you for participating in the Club of Budapest. We're very excited to have you on board and look forward to lots more collaboration.
Wonderful. It's my pleasure. Thanks, Swan.
Bye.